Hi everybody and welcome to today's Legal Aid Queensland webinar. I'd just like to start by, on behalf of everyone in the room today, paying our respects to the First Nations custodians of the land where our office stands in Brisbane today, where we work to help disadvantaged Queenslanders with their legal rights. I'd like to pay respect to the elders, law, customs and creation spirits, and also recognise all of the lands where our audience are linking in from today. Today's webinar is on natural disaster legal help. We're running a question and answer series, so thank you very much to everybody who has sent through some questions for Paul this morning, and we're welcoming questions as we go, so please continue to send through your questions. Now, Paul is our content expert today. Paul, you have probably all seen him working on flood and natural disaster legal help around Queensland. He's been out and about helping with natural disasters, and he's got a lot of great tips for you all on how to deal with insurers and how to help your clients deal with their insurance agencies and navigate their policies and what that means for their individual situations. Just a few housekeeping slides this morning. The webinar is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel. You can access that through the webinars page on Legal Aid Queensland's website. If you do need any technical support this morning, we have in the PowerPoint a customer support line that you can do online. I also encourage you to just download the handouts. So just in your toolbar, you'll see the handouts section. We've got two really great handouts in there today. One is on natural disaster legal help, and the other will be Paul's slides, which he has kindly shared with everyone today. And as I mentioned, feel free to submit any further questions, as many as you like. There's no limit today. All right, we're going to run a quick poll. So because we're working with an online audience, this is going to help Paul get to know you, understand what type of support and information you might need today. So we're just wondering what your role is. Are you a support worker, a community worker or health worker? Do you work in education? I know we have a lot of financial counsellors linking in today. If you don't mind using the other box, if you're a financial counsellor. I know we also have a few community lawyers linking in today as well. All right, we've still got a few answers coming through. We might close that off now and share the results with you. Thanks everyone for answering those. I can see that we have a lot of financial counsellors and other workers that aren't listed on the screen today, as well as some fantastic people from the education sector and community and support sector. We're gonna run through a few polls this morning. Our next poll just focuses on what region you work in. Are you from South East Queensland, Regional Queensland, Far North Queensland, or outside of Queensland? I can see we've got a big jump of people from outside of Queensland today. And so, Paul, do you mind just letting us know if the content will apply today Australia-wide?
Yeah, so the content around insurance law is national law. If there's anything that's specific to the state of Queensland, we'll talk about that as we're going through.
Fantastic, thank you, Paul. And we've got Emma with us today running the screen. She's just shared those results with you just for your own interest. And we're running into our third poll before I hand over to Paul. This is completely optional. It just helps us get to know our audience again. Are you of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin? And if you prefer not to say, that's completely fine. We might close that one off and keep that for our own records today. Thank you. Thank you everyone for answering those. We'll move on to our next slide. All right, and I'm going to hand over to Paul, who's going to be able to run through the content today, and again we will be moving into the Q&A soon. I can see someone's put through their role as a flood funded financial counsellor. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing your role with us today. That's really helpful for us to just get to know what type of information you'll need running through. So thank you so much, Paul, for joining us. I'll leave it with you.
And we'll start the discussion. So I guess the starting point we want to cover today is we're 12 months past a lot of major flooding that started in Queensland, New South Wales and other states sort of this time last year and a little bit earlier last year. And we thought it was a good time to catch up on where people might now be at in the process of their insurance claims. And in that intervening period, we've had pretty short floods in just about every state and territory in Australia. And we've also more recently had some bushfires in parts of the Western Downs of Queensland, and the monsoon up in northern Australia is certainly in full force at the moment. So all of those things led to us deciding it's probably a good time to have a chat. Legal Aid, of course, has a disaster line, which I'll plug right now, 1300 527 700, where people are able to come and get advice about any flood-related legal issue. And thank you to the acknowledgement of country that's come through on the chat. And I should add welcome to those who are listening in who are of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background. We appreciate you joining us. So let's dive straight into the issues. I think that's the best place to start. So where we're at is 12 months later, most people have lodged their insurance claim. If you get somebody that has not lodged an insurance claim and has insurance, I would please encourage you to get them to lodge that straight away. People will tell you, oh, I don't think I'm covered. My response usually to that is, that's not your decision to make, or that's not your job. If you've got insurance, lodge the claim, let an insurer look at it, and then when they come back, that's when you come to a lawyer like us to say, if they deny it, just come to a lawyer and us say, are they right? If they prove it, happy days. But if they don't, that's the point to come to a lawyer. But it's really hard for us to do anything if there's no claim at all. So that's the starting point.
And Paul, if they were affected 12 months ago, can they still lodge a claim? There is no time cut off.
There is no time limit for lodging a claim. There are time limits if you've lodged a claim and complained about a refusal, then you've got 2 years from when the insurer's internal dispute resolution area has looked at the claim to potentially lodge a claim in the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. But where you're at the stage where you haven't even lodged a claim, you're fine. Obviously, the later you leave lodging a claim, the harder it is to provide the evidence of what happened to you. But in the days of social media and the days of CCTV footage,
yes,
there's usually a lot of video around about what happened in particular areas. And I know AFCA's said publicly that there have been cases where they've actually used CCTV footage to identify what happened in a particular area. So it's not as hard as it once was, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago when there wasn't as much video around and technology around to lodge those later claims. But
of course,
it is going to be hard.
It is, but keep all of your documentation and submit it, and you're here to help along the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But where we're at 12 months later, so those of lodged claims, is we're usually having a lot of questions around scope of works, cash settlements, and those of you who know me, this is a personal bugbear, maintenance and wear and tear clauses. So they're the three we'll probably focus a lot on today. So let's start with a claim's been approved. If your claim's been approved, what usually happens is a scope of works needs to be put together. Now, scope of works documents, I find, scare a lot of people and generally scare a lot of lawyers I talk to as well. The reason is they're very technical documents put together by a lawyer, not by a lawyer, by a builder.
Mm-hmm.
And what the object of those documents are is to set out every single little thing, right down to the nails and hammering the nails in, that needs to be done to put your property back in the position it was in prior to the disaster affecting it. Mm-hmm. Now, there is, shall I say, not always helpful information on the internet that says the scope of works has to be perfect before you sign off it and get the work being done. Not true. And the reality of why that's not true is we see when builders start work and say knock down a wall or pull out the plasterboard, they often find more damage. And when they find more damage, it's perfectly reasonable, and builders do it all the time, for you or the builder to go back to them, the insurer, and say, we've found this extra damage. Mm-hmm. Can we vary the scope of works?
So Paul, in this situation, it would then be best to try and stay with the insurer to have the work done. Is that true?
So the thing about an insurance claim is, as long as you're insured when the event happened and when you lodged the claim, mm-hmm. in theory you can change insurers after that. But we'll park that for a moment because there's a practical reality about trying to change insurers when you're in a disaster affected zone. Mm-hmm. And that is that no insurer is required to offer you insurance or give you insurance just because you ask for it. Mm. Or what might happen is they'll certainly charge you a very high premium for doing it, which may be more than your existing insurance. So all of those things play into it. But just we'll park that and come back to it. Scope of works, though, that works if you're getting the builder to redo the work or the builder to do the fixing. Mm-hmm. What sometimes happens is either the insurer will say, we're going to cash settle you based on this scope of works, or you might decide you want to accept a cash settlement. And a cash settlement is effectively you ending your insurance claim with that insurer. And so in terms of cash settlements, many clients tend to grab at it because, let's be honest, following a disaster, it's very stressful. You're dealing with the insurer, you're dealing with the local council, you're usually having to deal with your bank, you're dealing with a whole manner of government departments, usually all of whom have pages and pages of stuff for you to fill out. Mm-hmm. In Queensland at the moment, there's the Resilient Homes Fund that a lot of people are applying to as well. People think if you've got the option of dealing with one less person, that's got to be a good thing. And I understand that. That's a perfectly reasonable idea. The problem is that it's not quite that simple. Mm-hmm. And in terms of cash settlements and the scope of works, whereas when somebody's doing the building work on behalf of the insurer, you can go back and ask for a variation. If you've accepted a cash settlement, that's effectively ending the claim. And it's much harder to go back and argue for the variations unless there's exceptional circumstances or there's been something really obviously missed. It's just a lot harder.
So Paul, what you're saying there in that sense is if you have a client who is planning on taking a cash settlement or is being pushed into taking a cash settlement from the insurer, that's when you would want to have absolutely every little thing in your scope of work.
Well, you want to be very confident that the amount is going to allow you to successfully rebuild the property. And where that comes into it, and that's point 3 on the slide you guys are seeing at the moment, is it's not just about rebuilding, it's about the fact that insurers can get work done cheaper than you as a member of the general public can. So any cash settlement has to take into account an allowance recognising it's going to cost you more than it would an insurer. Mm-hmm. Be very careful though when you're thinking about that, because that allowance is made at the time you're settling.
Yes.
And at the moment, I'm hearing it's anywhere, depending on the area of Australia you're in, it's anywhere between 6 to 18 months before you can actually get access to a builder. Some people are getting it earlier, and good luck to them, they're lucky, but that's the round figures I'm hearing. And given the way inflation is at the moment, I couldn't hazard, and I'm not an economist, but I think costs are going to continue to increase. Everything is pointing that way. So what you're settling for now, there's a risk that the value of work you can get for that in 12 or 18 months' time is actually less. So that's worth thinking about. But I think the most common question I get, or the most unknown thing, is people look at me blankly when I say, have you talked to the person who's got your mortgage? And the reason that's important is most mortgages have a clause in them that says words to the effect of, if an insured gets a cash settlement, the bank or the lender has access to that cash settlement.
Right.
And so it's really important to have a conversation with your bank who's got your mortgage, or your lender who's got your mortgage, about what their process is if you get a cash settlement. Because all these lenders have different processes. Some might be quite happy for you to get the money yourself and just do the work. Others might say, no, the money needs to be paid to us, and when you provide us with a builder's invoice, then we'll pay it. There's also a risk that a lender might say, no, we're keeping it and putting it on the mortgage. That's incredibly rare, but it is something that they're entitled to do in theory under the mortgage.
And Paul, are they notified? Is your mortgage holder notified when you get a cash settlement, or are you legally obliged to notify them yourself?
Yeah, the reality is, on your insurance, you're required to note that there's a mortgage on the property. So the insurer knows there's somebody with a mortgage. And so that's how that conversation usually happens. So you're not usually, it's not something, for want of a better word, that you can forget to tell the insurer about.
Yes, I see.
People know. But so that's why it's really important to have that conversation before you accept a cash settlement, just so you know where you're at about it.
Yeah, that makes sense, Paul.
The other thing that's really important to think about in accepting a cash settlement is, how am I building project management skills? Because if you accept a cash settlement, what you're taking on the responsibility for is organising all the trades to come in the right order at the right time on particular days, so that the work can be done in the correct order, so that the property can be fixed. And look, I've had clients who are in their 70s or 80s who've been offered a cash settlement, and the reality is the vast majority of people in that position who are that age either have better things to be doing, or are no longer in a position where they can successfully do that. So they're the sorts of considerations you need to think about, because particularly when we're dealing with, in a lot of places, a shortage of trades, actually getting access to them, getting them to come, organising them, is nearly a full-time job.
Absolutely. And it's not often that you would have an allocated amount to then engage your own project manager on a scope of work.
Very rarely. And so if you're in that vulnerable position, and I've used, and I don't want to be ageist, but I've used that just because it's an easier example. Same would apply to somebody, say, experiencing a disability or might be experiencing mental health conditions. It's worth, if you're in that position and not confident, and the insurer is saying, we're going to cash settle you, actually have a conversation with them along the lines of, I don't think I'd be able to get this work done without somebody helping me. Because my experience is, when I've raised that with insurers, the vast majority of the time, they'll go out of their way to try and organise somebody to help you when you're in that vulnerable position and not being able to do it yourself. Because there are reasons why sometimes an insurer will offer a cash settlement. And part of that, and usually where that occurs, is where you get your claim partially approved. and it might be partially approved because some damage has occurred by flood, and then there might also be damage that might have been pre-existing or might be under an exclusion under your insurance policy, which they can't cover you for. But before they can do their work that's covered, you need to do some work that's not covered first. And so the theory is we'll cash settle you to allow you time to fix the bit that we're not covering, and then you'll have the money to fix the bit that is covered under the insurance policy.
Because they can't warrant their work if there's maintenance needed on the property that could affect.
Well, sometimes they can't actually do the work at all properly until that first bit is covered. So I always think it's really important to have a conversation with a lawyer if you're in that position, just so we can check that the insurer is right. One, about some of the work or some of the damage not being covered, and then two, about is there a way of getting that work done as quickly as possible.
We just have a note on this. Paul, someone's writing into us, just sharing their experience where people have an unreleased mortgage. Even people with unreleased mortgage for cash settlement has been held by banks. Yeah,
and that's the reality of what we're saying. So even you might have paid the mortgage out, but if the mortgage is not released and it's sitting on there, that those funds do potentially get paid to the mortgagee. So well done on your advocacy to get the bank to agree to release the funds to pay invoices, and that's why we thought it was really important to have this discussion around cash settlements and mortgages, because that's a risk that a lot of clients that all of us speak to aren't actually aware of.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other important thing to talk about is around rebuilding or walking away, because there can be really good reasons to accept a cash settlement. And the classic, and I'll use bushfires as a classic example. If you've been in a bushfire area and a bushfire has come through and completely destroyed your property, and those of us who have been to bushfire areas, that's a terrible sight when there's just literally nothing left. You might not want to rebuild in that place again, because the trauma of being in that place and thinking, oh, when's the next fire coming through, could be too much for you. And if that's the case, what you need to have a conversation with people, the lender, about is how are we dealing with the mortgage that might be applying to that property? Because it might be reasonable for you to want to walk away and build somewhere else, but working out how the bank wants to deal with that security is a really important part of that discussion. I find banks, when you have that discussion with them, generally speaking, try to work something out that works for everybody, but it's important you have that discussion.
Absolutely.
So there's no requirement that you have to rebuild, but I think it's really important that you have the discussion about how can we do that and still meet the responsibilities I have, which just after a disaster is often the last thing you want to do, but having the conversation early generally reduces the problems and the difficulties that you face.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why getting onto that, the trauma and the difficulty of being in that situation, that's why we really appreciate our audience today and all the community workers and financial counsellors and health workers and education workers out there who are helping clients to be able to go through all of this. And Paul's such a great asset for us, and he's a great person to connect with. So yeah, if you need any further conversations after this webinar, then please do get in touch with Legal Aid, because Paul and his team are really fantastic at helping you have strategies to help your clients go through all of this.
Thank you. And I guess the other important people we haven't talked about so far in this discussion is it's often small business who are directly affected by disasters. And while Legal Aid doesn't do a huge amount of that 5-day work, we do have a farm and rural legal service unit that helps rural small businesses and farmers with financial problems and financial trouble. So I'll just flag that's an area that not everybody knows Legal Aid does work in.
Yeah, of course.
And unfortunately, you tend to find rural areas are often affected by disasters, particularly flooding.
Yeah.
And so accessing that sort of support is really important as well.
And people can get access to legal aid in rural areas as well, because you do a lot of teleconferencing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you don't have to visit a local office.
No, and I know our family law lawyers will often visit people where appropriate in those areas as well.
Yeah.
But we do have a great collection of rural and regional offices as well, dotted up and down the coast in Queensland.
Yeah.
Who service such a wide space in Queensland.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess where that takes us from when we're talking about cash settlements, we were talking about the fact that sometimes you'll get a partial offer or a partial settlement where some's covered and some's not. And often the reason an insurer will identify why you're not covered is there's exclusions and policies for a lack of maintenance or wear and tear. And we'll just jump ahead from the change of mind and come back to it. No, actually, we'll go back. I'll take that back. We'll deal quickly with these couple of issues and then we'll get into maintenance. The idea around change of mind is people are concerned that if you get your claim accepted, your insurer might be able to change their mind when they do some further investigation.
Yeah.
And look, there's a section in the Insurance Contracts Act that talks about that allows them to refuse a claim because of acts or omissions after the contract. The reality of that situation is, if you've been honest with the insurer, you genuinely don't have a problem. My experience is it's when people are dishonest, they've potentially engaged in fraud, they've not told the truth either by act or omission, that's when an insurer will do a bit of a deeper dive, and that's when you potentially get in trouble. The vast majority of people I encounter following disasters aren't interested in doing any of that. They're interested in lodging the claim, getting it assessed, and then having the insurer do the work for them, or if they refuse it, complaining about why that work hasn't been done. So I wouldn't be worried about that happening, because it doesn't happen often in my experience. But if you get a client where it does happen too, it's important they get legal advice, particularly if an insurer, which they do sometimes, starts a thing called a fraud investigation or is looking at it further like that.
Okay.
Because that carries with it potential criminal consequences. And that's why you could get legal advice, for example, from legal aid criminal lawyers if it gets to that point. So that's a really important part of this. The other thing that's happening 12 months later, and it was remiss of me to skip straight to maintenance and not deal with this, people are over it.
Absolutely.
12 months later,
yeah,
they're not back in their property, they're sick of living in a unit somewhere, or they're sick of living in a hotel, they just want to get home. So there are, and they also feel, and what often happens when you get to that point, the clients is often ringing the insurer daily saying, what's going on, hurry up, what's happening, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So there are time limits about insurers responding to inquiries, which I've set out on the slide. And you've got 10 business days if it's a routine inquiry. If you're not making a routine inquiry, they should be updating you every 20 days. The thing about delays is it's often dependent on the reason for the delays. Delays as a general rule are bad, and neither the insurer or the person who's been affected has any interest in delays being extended any longer than they possibly have to. But if you are in the position where you feel like the insurer is just not responding, and that's taking into account those 10 and 20 business days I've identified for you, that's when you can consider complaining about the delays to IDR and then the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, because there is an expectation that your claim will be progressed as quickly as humanly possible. There have been delays over the last 12 months, and I don't think there's any shying away from that. But when you look at the volume of people who've been affected over the last 12 months, and some people, particularly in New South Wales, have been affected a number of times in that period. And even in Queensland, for example, before the floods, there's a group who were affected by hailstorms in October 2021, and then also flooded in February 2022. That complicates it a little bit. But if you reach a point where you think it's unreasonable, talk to us. And we can talk you through whether that delay is unreasonable. But to be fair, when it comes to delays, most of us have got a pretty good antenna about what's okay and what's not.
Yeah.
And that the only caveat I'd put on that is, depending on the nature of the trades, sometimes there's just no tradespeople to do the work, particularly some of the more specialised trades. So just be aware that sometimes people saying, or an insurer saying, they're available in 3 months is because that's when they're available, because they're doing other jobs for those 3 months.
So Paul, does that mean you can help when people have delays receiving an outcome on their claim, as well as delays on the work taking place?
Yeah, both of those are delays worth talking to a lawyer about. And I think it's reasonable to have that conversation.
Definitely.
And it's also reasonable to have that conversation with insurers. So I would encourage too, as we're talking, any other questions, we're prompting questions, or I haven't explained something properly, or I haven't covered something you want to hear about, just drop those in the question box and we can address them as we're going.
Definitely. And Paul, you said people can get in touch with you for help on these delays. Is that through the phone number you mentioned at the start of the webinar?
Yeah, so 1300 527 700. Now we've had a question come through around councils and inadequate drainage systems. The way I think we need to talk about that in this context is that's a very factually dependent question about drainage, about planning approvals for housing estates. All of those sorts of things are things that are worth considering and worth talking to private lawyers about. Dealing with planning approvals and environment and planning law is a very specialised area, which Legal Aid doesn't do any work in. But you get in contact with your local law society. In Queensland, that's the Queensland Law Society, and they'd be able to direct you to an appropriate private lawyer for your clients to talk to about those particular issues. Because that will be, as I say, very factually dependent. But it's a really good question as to how that would work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you for that question.
All right. And we've got another one here about living in the property. If you can't live in your property because it was flood affected and not deemed livable, then how does it work with insurance companies and requesting that they pay your rent? Does it depend on your individual policy with your insurer, or is there a law that they do need to cover your rent if it's deemed unlivable for mould or things like that?
So what that's referring to is temporary accommodation. And the vast majority of insurance policies will have a specific clause that deals with how temporary accommodation will be dealt with. And it's generally two ways. One says we will cover you for, it's usually 12 months of temporary accommodation while the property's been fixed. And the other is we will cover you up to a particular amount. It might be a percentage of the sum insured, for example. I tend to find accommodation can be very expensive following a disaster, and that amounts can be eaten up fairly quickly. And unfortunately, that's the reality of that type of policy. The other thing that happens around the 12 months where you're covered for 12 months for temporary accommodation is the work might not be done. So if particularly you've got a 12-month temporary accommodation clause in the policy, I think it's really important, if it's getting to the end of that 12 months, which we are now, and it doesn't look like the property is going to be fixed, it's really important to have a conversation about that with the insurer to see whether they'd be willing to extend that coverage a little bit further. Legally, you don't have much strength in that argument, but it never hurts to have a conversation, particularly if you can point to some of the delay being as a result of something the insurer had done.
Yeah, so that's just a negotiation with your individual insurer. That's very
and you lose nothing by having the conversation.
Absolutely.
So yes, absolutely, that clause is there. It's not payment that has to occur till the end of time, but it is a good protection in there. And if it's about to run out, talk to the insurer and talk to us.
Definitely.
All right, let's move, I think, now to the next slide, where we're going to have a poll.
It's a bit of a quiz, this one. So just making sure that everybody has been understanding the types of things that Paul's been talking about, and helping us understand your knowledge moving forward to the second half of our Q&A webinar series today. So we've got a question for you. Put yourself in these shoes. You're a community worker supporting a single mum. Her name is Angie. She has 3 children who have been affected by some recent storms in Queensland. Her claim was delayed by more than 6 months. We've just gone over the delays, and now they've been the claim has been partially denied due to wear and tear on Angie's roof. So how do you think you could help Angie prove the storm damage, prove what the storm damage was caused by? Do you think it would be helpful to gather photos showing that the roof wasn't actually damaged prior to the storm, if it wasn't caused by the storm? Bills or proof of recent roof maintenance. She might have recently had tiles replaced, flashing replaced, or a full roof restoration, and she could use that as proof. Or do you think that both of these items would be helpful to support your client, Angie? And everybody's answered all of the above. Paul, is there anything more you wanted to talk on with this one?
Look, I think it's leading into my favourite topic of maintenance, is what I suspect it is, and we'll cover the issues around maintenance. Now, you do have responsibility to keep your property maintained and keeping, that's effectively the way I look on that, that's keeping it in a livable condition that would protect it against your more obvious perils of nature. Where that goes wrong is sometimes you'll see, particularly following a flood, storm or cyclone, a claim denied because you haven't maintained the property or due to wear and tear. It's difficult to be too specific because each policy generally from each insurer or each brand generally has a different definition of what maintenance actually is, which makes it hard for consumers. But my rule of thumb around maintenance is it's an exclusion from an insurance policy. So it's not up to you to prove that the property has been maintained at the initial point. It's up to the insurer to prove that it hasn't been maintained or there is wear and tear to the property.
I see.
So that to me is the key starting point. So if what I've found, and if I've raised this with insurers and the Insurance Council, is people will get a one line in an assessor or an expert's report saying the property was not maintained, and that's what's used to deny the claim. To me, that's not good enough to rely on an exclusion. To me, if you're going to rely on a maintenance exclusion, you should be able to say what the maintenance was you say the person should have done or ought to have done, and would that actually have made a difference to the end result? Like, for example, if a cyclone comes through and you had a big hole in your roof and you didn't fix it before the cyclone, or you maintain your house, to me that's a really good reason to deny a claim on the basis of wear and tear and maintenance. If there was one nail missing from a roof, like I've previously seen in an expert's report, unless I get some really good explanation as to how that one nail was the reason the roof was taken off, to me that's not a really good reason to deny a maintenance claim. That's not okay. So to me, if you've got somebody with a claim that's been denied because of maintenance, come and talk to a lawyer about it, because I'm really keen on checking into just how those maintenance clauses are being handled, because it's not okay to just generally deny a claim on a lack of maintenance if you then can't show us why, that would have made a difference.
Yeah. So that's something you and your team can help with, Paul.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
The other thing that will happen in that space is around wear and tear. And what we're seeing, we see a lot of following floods, is around subsidence, which is the ground either moving up or down, and that affecting the stability of a house.
Yeah.
Or it's Queensland, there's a lot of houses on stumps, and maintaining those stumps can be very important too. And we have seen cases being denied on the fact that the stumps haven't been, or there's wear and tear of the stumps, or they haven't been properly maintained. And that's where you might see a partial payment for some other damage, but people being told you've got to fix this bit around the stumps before we can do our work. Really important they get legal advice so that we can go through those reports around the stumps and around what happened to that property to see what's going on. The other classic example, the protection and the maintenance is around roofs. Queensland's classic for storms. Big hailstorms went through and big storms went through. It was only, I think it was only last week. I lose track of time, unfortunately, with disasters in Queensland. And I know the Burnett around Bundaberg has had some big storms in the last couple of weeks as well. And of course, up north is experiencing the monsoon and all its glory over the last, particularly in the Gulf. And the last photo I saw of the road closures up the Gulf is, I'm not sure there was a single road open in particular areas because the water had come through. All of those storms, being aware of that and being aware that it's worth, if you can afford it, getting somebody up on the roof every couple of years and checking. Checking into the tiles, checking what's there. There shouldn't be an expectation, for example, that a 70-year-old who's got maybe a physical impairment or a physical health condition should be the one getting up on that roof. But there are experts who will do that for you. And keeping a record of how that's done is really important.
Of course.
Now, I see we've got a maintenance question come through.
So could someone be denied for something? Could someone be denied because of maintenance if, for example, you have large trees nearby and the trees cause the damage? So I guess if a tree fell on the property, or the roots of the trees could also be causing damage, but otherwise the property is healthy. Yeah.
And this goes back to the problem that we have different definitions of maintenance across the different insurance policies. Because and it would also depend on how far the trees are away from your property, things like that. Like if you've got a tree near your property, to me, and this is just a personal view, this isn't an insurer's view, reasonable maintenance of a large tree to your property is making sure any dead branches are taken away or taken off quickly and promptly. If there's a particular branch overhanging the house, I'm thinking I might be getting somebody to take that out. But if it's otherwise healthy and there's no obvious danger, then to me, what more should a homeowner be doing? There's probably not a lot. But they're the factual dependent discussions that we want people coming to talk to us about, particularly if it gets denied on that basis.
Yeah, of course.
Like I heard a story the other day where a claim was denied on the basis of lack of maintenance for the floods, where their property was damaged a few months ago and they'd only just got the cash payout from the first claim.
Oh, that's very difficult.
And what's a person supposed to do? I'm still waiting to see whether the story I've heard is in fact true. But that's a potential example of maintenance being inappropriately applied.
Yes, because once you've taken that cash settlement, you were saying,
you've then got to have a reasonable opportunity to get the work done.
And you're not insured on that portion of your property, are you, Paul, until you've had the work completed by a registered builder or a qualified trade? So
for an insurer to reinsure it for the value, they're going to look for some certification that the building work has been done properly. And that probably feeds in nicely to, I think, a question that's just come through around that claim being denied on the pitch of a roof extension not being correct. Now, that opens up all sorts of questions around if they had the work done, and that's not this case, they have an obligation to make sure that's done properly.
Yes.
But if they bought the property, you're relying on building inspections then.
And was the pitch of the roof legal at the time it was built?
Absolutely.
Building regulations have
all of those,
changed.
all of those things would play into that. And might open up, because what I suspect happened in this story is the pitch of the roof has probably changed the angle of the flow of the water, and that's what's caused the damage. Now, if they had no way of knowing, and that becomes quite difficult, but the responsibility might have been on them in terms of making sure the building inspection was done properly. And if the building inspection didn't pick it up, they probably need to talk to a lawyer about, do they have any rights around the building inspection as opposed to the insurance.
That's a different battle.
And that's a whole different battle again.
Which is why it's really important to just chat with Paul, because he's just got a wealth of knowledge, and every situation is so different, and there might be other avenues that you can explore. Yeah,
but it does raise an interesting question around what responsibilities insurers have for identifying what type of property they're insuring. And look, the reality is it's in nobody's interest, the insurer or the person getting insured, for that description of the property to be wrong.
Yes.
But it is dependent usually on you giving the insurer appropriate information about the type of property you've got and things like that.
Yeah.
And that can be, for a lot of people, a difficult question to try and deal with, because to be honest, I don't know what type of roof I have on my property, and most of us don't.
No, and when you're applying for insurance, not a lot of questions are asked, to be honest, about your property, other than the standard, how many bedrooms, bathrooms, stories.
And that gets us on to the whole idea of insurance calculators that many insurers now have on their website for trying to identify how much money you should be insured for. Because there's a big problem out there either with no insurance or underinsurance. No insurance is usually where people can't afford the insurance, and that's a big problem. I think the biggest premium I've seen following the floods was in the region of $21,000, maybe $25,000. Most of us can't afford that every 12 months. Most of us can't afford the $4 to $8 grand in a lot of flood areas, which I see is common. But on the underinsurance, that's where you haven't insured it for enough money to properly rebuild the property. And that either happens because you've decided to pay a lesser premium on the theory that some insurance is better than none.
Yes.
Or what could often happen is you've insured your property for a sum insured rather than getting the property rebuilt, and that sum insured doesn't cover, say, the building codes might have changed or the property might have changed.
We've got one person commenting, Paul,
$6,000 a month for flood insurance.
And she's been flooded 4 times.
Ouch. That the person that's put that question through, I would really love, if your community member is comfortable, you sending me that as a case study, because I think that's something that insurers and regulators need to see.
That's over 60,000.
My quick math says that's about $72,000 a year, which is more than a lot of people's yearly wage.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's unaffordable for a lot of people.
Yeah. So so that's where we're at, I think, in terms of maintenance. We digressed a little bit from maintenance there, but I think that discussion we had was really important.
Definitely.
So,
move on.
Now, we covered changing insurers a little bit earlier. You can change your insurer if you were insured at the time the claim was lodged and you were insured at the time the event happened. And people when they feel they haven't been treated well by their insurer, are often keen on saying, can I change my insurer? I'm sick of them. I want to deal with somebody else. A couple of things to think about if you're going to do that. One is, am I going to get the same cover? Am I increasing the cover, reducing it, and being aware of all of that? The other thing to think about is insurers don't actually have to insure you just because you ring them up.
Yeah.
And many insurers, or a number of insurers I've heard, might be more reluctant to take on new clients in flood-affected areas because all they're doing is effectively adding a bad risk to their insurance book. And they have responsibilities as a company to their shareholders to avoid taking on too much bad risk.
So would it be important then, Paul, to source some quotes from other insurers before even advising your current insurer of your intention to cancel?
There is absolutely nothing wrong with shopping around. Nothing wrong at all. And getting an idea of what you could get. The trick is making sure you've compared the coverage. And that is very difficult because no one insurance policy I've seen is the same as another one. There's different wording, there's different clauses, there's different types of coverage within the policy. So it's really important if you're thinking about changing to get your head around all of that.
And Paul, do you mind if we just go back to underinsurance again? We've had a question from a worker just asking for any tips to help with people who put their own price on what their property is worth. So an insurer might say, I've calculated your property to be this much, for example, but you can pick your own price.
Yeah, and look, the thing about that is insurers usually are basing that on some expert evidence about the value of the property in that area and their knowledge of what it would cost to rebuild it. And what people often don't think about in terms of considering that cost is I might have to rebuild it differently because building codes change in a flood area, they change in a fire area and require additional things to be put into a property if you're rebuilding it from scratch.
Yes.
So although I have seen on occasions insurers give a wrong amount that's drastically over-insuring the value of a property, for the most part, those figures are pretty close to the mark, better than pretty close to the mark. But often people will choose a different figure, I find, because they can't afford the premiums on that amount.
Yes.
And cost of living is a big issue, and it was a big issue prior to the disaster last year, and with all the interest rate rises in the last little while, it's becoming more and more of an incredibly big issue.
And a lot of people, I imagine, would just be banking on only ever needing a partial claim
rather than having a property totally destroyed.
Yes.
And if you can get away with that, good luck to you. But in the event of a total destruction of the property, that's really hard. But having said that, some of it is people just don't understand what they need to be insured for. Insurance is technical, it's hard, and that's why insurers have tried developing those calculators.
Yes.
My experience from clients is some of them find them useful and some of them find them really hard. And I know insurers are still working on the quality of those calculators.
Yeah, absolutely.
But on the cost of living, just as we're nearing the end, we'll put in a shameless plug because cost of living and legal issues is next month's webinar.
Definitely. So
shameless plug.
Yeah, mid-March, Paul will be back again to talk
with
about
my colleague Christy.
Living with Christy. Yeah.
So as we're nearing the end of the webinar, I'll just put one final call out for any other questions and put out there that if other questions occur to you during the course of the day or the course of the week, just shoot us an email and we can respond to those questions.
Definitely.
As and when you send them through, because that's no problem at all.
Thanks, Paul. That's really helpful. And everybody can email webinars@legalaid.qld.gov.au. And Emma and I can pass those questions on to Paul and his team for a response.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're in a different state and don't know who you need to talk to in that state, shoot us an email and we can point you in the right direction for lawyers like us who do that work in your own state.
Yeah, definitely. Paul has a wealth of knowledge and has a lot of referrals he can help with.
Now, the final thing we wanted to deal with, and scams is a big issue, watch out for door knockers in a disaster area following a flood. If you get a door knocker, ask for ID. If they can't give you the ID, tell them to go away. If they give you a phone number, don't just ring the phone number to get verification of who they are. Jump on that company's website and make sure it's a valid phone number. Because scammers are sophisticated these days, and it's not beyond them to have set their mate up to answer phone calls checking their ID.
Definitely, and it's very easy to apply for an ABN and make it appear to be a business when it might actually just be a couple of people trying to make 30 grand off.
The other thing about it is, if they want you to sign something straight away, ask to take it away and get it reviewed by somebody else in the family, or you when you've got a clear mind and you're not under stress of them being at the door. If they won't let you take a copy of the contract away to think about, that should be a red flag that something's up. Now, there are companies who not following disasters offering to manage a claim for you. That costs you money, and happily those companies now have to be licensed.
Fantastic.
So if they do that door knocking and ask for help, ask about their license. But the other thing I would say is it costs nothing to do an insurance claims process. It's free to make your claim to the insurer, it's free to complain to IDR, and it's free to contact the Australian Financial Complaints Authority and pursue the claim there if you need to. You do not need to pay somebody for help. If you need help, there are free legal services like ourselves, like community legal centres right around the country, who can give you that good, unbiased legal advice about where you're at and what your rights are.
And Paul, we did have a question about what charges are involved with making claims and what the referral process is. So would you say just contact Legal Aid, and if we can't help, we'll refer you on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Our contact centre does a great job, particularly if it's not us, of pointing you in the right direction of who it is.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Paul. Now we're going to move on to our final poll, and then we do have a few questions after this that has come through that we will get to. So this is just another question to help us understand how you've been understanding the content today. Imagine you have a client named Toby. Toby is 19. He claimed on his insurance due to flood damage in the March 22 floods in southeast Queensland. His insurance was denied his claim 9 months later. How do you think the best way to support Toby would be? Connecting him to legal advice, such as Paul and the team, helping him find out why it was denied, helping him through his insurer's internal dispute scheme, complaining to AFCA on his behalf and with his consent, or could all of the above be really helpful for Toby? And everybody's answered all of the above
correctly, which is good.
Perfect.
All right, so we've really covered how Legal Aid can help. Call a disaster line, get in contact with us, and we can do the help from there. In terms of questions we haven't answered, I think we've covered pretty much all of the ones that came through.
We've covered pretty much all of them, Paul. I might just reiterate a couple. Someone's been given funding as the Flood Recovery Hub in Logan and wondered how legal aid services can fit in with that hub and that funding.
And get in contact. If somebody's got specific flood funding, we think it's really important to work together as much as possible, because clients get better results when there's more brains on things. So we're happy to have those discussions with anybody that wants to.
Definitely, just get in touch with us. Someone's also asked if there's any concession fees for people from Cantonese or Chinese speaking backgrounds.
And the answer is we have interpreters. They're free, so there's no charge for people accessing in that. in that circumstance.
And we also have a system on our website that can read our content aloud in many multiple languages. So it would be worth jumping on our
Absolutely.
website and seeing that. And there's usually no cost involved with Paul's assistance as well.
Yeah, that initial advice, no problem at all.
Top 3 messages, Paul. You've given us a lot of key messages today. If you had to sum it up into just 3 messages that the workers who have logged in today could pass on to their clients, what do you think?
Look, I think the number one is it's okay to ask for information. If you're not understanding something the insurer says, not understanding something in the report, ask questions of them. If they're not answering it to your satisfaction, come and ask questions of us. That's number one. Number 2 is have the conversation as early as you can around mortgages and your bank, not just about the insurance and accepting cash settlement, but often finances are hard following a disaster. The earliest you have those conversations, the better. And 3, if your claim's been refused, you lose absolutely nothing about seeking help and saying, was this refusal right? Sometimes we'll say, yeah, the refusal is right, and sometimes we'll say, no, it's not, and here's what you need to do about it. And the 4th and final one that I haven't covered is actually be a little bit kind to yourself about this. Does that recovery from a disaster takes a while? As you're recovering from it, think about what can I do in terms of preparation that might mean if it happens to me again, the impact isn't as great.
Thank you, Paul. That's really helpful, and it might be worth just downloading that handout if you haven't already, because Paul's questions are really clearly laid out on that previous slide. So you could even just jot those down and pass that information, not the full set of slides, but just the top tips onto your clients as well. And just one final question for the day. We spoke a little bit about scammers posing as officials. We had a question about what type of security is there. Now you're saying that they need to be licensed.
Door knockers offering to help with your claim should be licensed.
Yeah.
Government officials door knocking on your door should have government ID that you can ask for. If they can't provide it for you, I'm not sure I'm talking to them. And it's also probably worth, rather than, if you're comfortable, often there are recovery centres set up following disasters where all those government support services, legal support, financial counselling support, insurers are often all there. So you've got a bit of confidence walking in there to a disaster recovery centre that those people are reputable and aren't going to scam you.
Thank you, Paul. It's been fantastic to have Paul here today just to answer the amazing questions that you guys have put forward to us. So thank you so much, Paul, for your presentation and having that conversation, making the time to talk with us about that today and to take on board everyone's questions. And we really appreciate our audience for engaging with us the way you do. And as Paul mentioned, he'll be back in March for a cost of living webinar with his colleague. So please stay tuned for that and download the handouts if you haven't already, because we've got some contact details for Legal Aid in general in there. And the number again, Paul, do you mind telling us the phone number again?
The disaster
helpline.
1300 527 700.
Thank you. And the email address for any further questions again is webinars@legalAid.qld.gov.au. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a nice rest of your day, and thanks again, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.